Have you ever wanted to draft in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet the Indigo Disk but don't really know where to start? Well, this is a series for you. What's going on, everybody? You have Tone here, back with episode number 2 of how to draft in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet the Indigo Disk. I'm not gonna lie, the amount of support I got from the first episode of this series was way beyond anything I ever would have imagined, and I got pretty much the most views ever on my channel, which was an absolute amazing feat for myself, and I was really happy to have started this series out, especially if it means I educate the Draft League community for both newer and more experienced Draft League players alike. If you guys missed that video, it will be linked in the top right hand corner so you can check it out if you guys missed it. But for this episode number 2, we're going to be doing things a little bit differently from episode 1 and not have a immediate Dragon Fairy Steel Core, but we're going to instead focus on more of one of the more formidable Pokemon that's ever been introduced in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. This episode, we're dealing with Iron Valiant, one of the best mixed attackers that ever graced Draft League format and Pokemon in general. Not from its unique fairy fighting typing, 130 attack, 120 special attack, 116 speed. It has all the right notes of everything you ever want in a Pokemon from an offensive perspective, being able to Sword Stance, Calm Mind, even run choice sets with Specs, Scarf, and it can even go mixed relatively easily. Of course, there is one caveat that comes with Iron Valiant: it can't do everything. And by that I mean, if you want to be set up, you want to have some offensive potential with Life Orb, you want to have boost your energy to boost your speed and be more of a sweeper. But then if you boost your energy, you can't really have that damage output unless you have a boosting move to go along with it. So it does kind of have that little bit of a iffy situation where you want to be a breaker and you want to be a sweeper, but you can't do both at the same time, which is sort of the pro and con of Iron Valiant. But it's still a formidable Pokemon in Draft League format, just for the versatility on the offensive side. So for this episode, I decided to pair up Iron Valiant with a pretty awesome balance core, in my opinion, in one of the more omnipresent Pokemon when it comes to being anti-removal in one Pokemon in Gholdengo, and pairing that with one of the best hazard setters known in Draft League format in Gliscor. So with that being said, let's jump right into, once again, the rules and roles if you guys missed episode 1. So first and foremost, the rules I'll be following. First and foremost, Terra will not be a factor in making the team. I want to use the Pokemon available to make up for any gaps of the team that may already have, and Terra will just be an extension of the offensive, let alone defensive positioning that you can use for that draft. The order of the Pokemon does not mean to draft it in that round. This just more so plays to the role of the team and how it functions. Pokemon that I put in a specific order obviously doesn't mean to get it in that round. There are Pokemon that people will value a lot earlier, so if you value that Pokemon a bit earlier, then by all means you can grab it if it works out for you. And lastly, third rule, alternate options will be provided at the end of the draft. I don't want people to go in, look at the draft and say, oh, that's great, I'm going to try to get this exact team. That's not going to happen. Snipes are a thing in Draft League format, and as any Draft League player knows, it's always good to have backup plans, and even a backup for the backup, because sometimes plan B will never come to you, let alone plan C. So if anything, always have alternate options in the back. As for the roles I will be following for making this Draft League team, first and foremost, we have our balance core in play with Gliscor and Gholdengo. It will be extended with the rest of my team, as well as trying to make Iron Valiant as best of a Pokemon as possible in terms of drafting and building a cohesive team around it. Form a defensive core. This is pretty much stressed in the sense that you don't want to get caught lacking in situations where you cannot react to your opponent's offensive threats, so having a defensive core to fall back on will be very, very manageable to have in the long run. At least 2 strong forms of priority. It doesn't really matter what kind of priority, as long as it's reliable and as long as it's strong and it's something that can pressure your opponent in any situation, because you really don't want to be building a team where you are going to get overwhelmed by your opponent's setup sweepers and you have no way to react and you're automatically losing the game on the spot. At least 2 stealth rockers. You want to have a situation, you don't want to be in a situation where you only draft 1 stealth rocker and you're forced to have that one Pokemon perform that specific role, especially if it can be a versatile Pokemon and branch out and do other stuff for your team. So having the ability to have multiple hazard setters is definitely crucial to have a good formidable draft. Spikes and toxic spikes. This is also an extension to the stealth rock setters. If your Pokemon can set up both stealth rock and spikes, that's great, but still try to at the very least have multiple forms of setting up hazards so you're not really relying on one Pokemon doing the setting. At least 1 form of hazard removal, whether it be rapid spin, defog, or even core change from Cinderace. While hazard removal in and of itself isn't really that detrimental, or it's not really much of a thing in terms of this generation, is because Gen 9 has become so offensive to the point where you're not really valuing removal that much, and when you rapid spin anyway, most people do it for the speed as opposed to the removal of the hazards. That's become more of a side thing now. And for the most part, since we're in a metagame where heavy duty boots is such a prey, it's pretty much one of the more formidable and crucial items for any draft team or in Pokemon in general. People can just slap on boots on anything and not have to worry about taking any entry hazard damage. So one way of removing hazards is definitely good enough for your draft. 2 Pokemon at least with a speed tier above base 110. This is basically just a precursor so you're not overwhelmed by Pokemon like Weavile, Meowscarada, or anything faster that can easily run an adamant or modest nature against your team. You really don't want to be taking all that extra damage if you can help it. So definitely having a 2 Pokemon above 110 is definitely preferred on this draft, and luckily we already have one of those Pokemon being Iron Valiant. At least one wall breaker. This is kind of already included with the starting core, because Iron Valiant can function as a wall breaker, but at the same time though, it doesn't actually have to be stuck in that role as a wall breaker. So you definitely want to have something that can break down your opponent's defensive cores and just be a nuisance for your opponent's team in general. So having a wall breaker at any time is definitely a plus to have on your team. 1 ground immunity, the ability to not have to have a team that is just destroyed by Earthquake from Great Tusk, from Excadrill, Landorus, Therian. You really don't want to have a team that's just EQ to hell and back. So having a grounded immunity is definitely preferred to have on any sort of draft league team, just for the fact of just not being overwhelmed by Pokemon like Great Tusk. It's definitely not a good thing to have in that sort of situation. 1 electric immunity, just because Volt Switch is one of the more formidable forms of grabbing momentum, and being able to block said momentum is definitely pivotal when it comes to building a team. You can't stop stuff like U-turn and baton pass or whatever, but having the way of blocking Volt Switch and stopping your opponent from getting momentum as you're switching in or whatever is really good to have. So having at least one way to stop Volt Switch is definitely preferred. 1 bulky water. This is pretty much nice because water typing has one of the better typings both offensively and defensively, and you can never go wrong with having the bulky water. It doesn't necessarily have to be fat like a Dondozo, but it can basically be any water type that can function, can multifaceted both offensively and defensively, and fulfill that role pretty well. So yeah, bulky water in that sort of typical fashion. 1 grounded poison type. You never want to be in a situation where your team gets overwhelmed or destroyed by toxic spikes, so having a grounded poison type at all times is definitely a mandatory thing to have, just so you're not just like worrying about having your team taking toxic or poison damage every single turn, especially if you don't want to be in a situation where you're slapping on heavy duty boots on your entire roster. That's not really a good form of a good draft team. At least 1 knockoff user. Item disruption is one of the best things to have for a draft league team, especially considering getting rid of heavy duty boots, getting rid of life orb choice items from your opponent forcing them to take that entry hazard damage that you set up is very, very important. And luckily for us, we already have a strong knockoff user in Iron Valiant. I'm blanking if Gliscor still gets it, but regardless, having at least one knockoff user is preferred to have, just so that way you're having the ability to get rid of your opponent's items, disrupt their strategy, and more importantly, if you set up entry hazards, you are ensuring that you're making them take that extra chip damage to make things easier for the rest of your team in the long run. And then finally, we have FWG and DFS, so Fire, Water, Grass, Dragon, Steel, Fairy Core. We don't have one right away, but I will be addressing that as we go. Fire, Water, Grass, and Dragon, Steel, Fairy is pretty much the two most common cores that you'll be seeing in Draft League format. And they're pretty nice to have, just because of the fact of the synergistic roles that they have both offensively and defensively between those typings in and of itself. So with that being said, let's jump right into the team that I ended up building for this core. So once again, we will be using the SPL draft board. Thank you again to Shuckle King and PokeMMD for letting me use the draft board for this episode. So as you can see, we already are under the assumption that Iron Valiant, Gholdengo, and Gliscor are going to be our first 3 picks. Granted, there are some situations where people can argue that Gholdengo isn't really a round 2 Pokemon. Some people will swear about this Pokemon and grab it round 1, whether they don't want to deal with it or they just have a real abundance and like the doggone thing too doggone much and don't want to face it. So there are some precedents, but I've seen situations where Gholdengo has gone round 2. I have drafted Gholdengo round 2 in a previous draft league. Obviously that was before the second DLC, but there has been instances where Gholdengo has fallen to round 2 and even lower rounds of that, and there's been instances where Gholdengo has gone completely undrafted. So I figured, just for the sake of sanity, I decided to make Gholdengo a round 2 pick, just because it felt a little bit safer to assume that Gholdengo would definitely at least be a round 2 selection, and then Gliscor is round 3. Could argue maybe it can go round 4, but I feel round 3 is a good enough assessment to make this team work the best as possible, and we're also under the assumption that none of these picks are going to get sniped from us. So with that being said, let's jump right into the build. So the first Pokemon I decided to take to pair up with these 3 Pokemon round number 4, I opted to go with Volcarona here for 14 points. Now this is a bit of a precursor here, but Volcarona fits so well with these first 3 mons, specifically with Iron Valiant and Gholdengo in particular, because one of the best answers to Volcarona is Heatran. What do this team already have? 2 ways of dealing with Heatran, Valiant and Gliscor. So having something in the back to deal with something like a Heatran, wear down those rock type Pokemon that can threaten out Volcarona, especially if you're using this sort of draft league format where only lower tier Pokemon can terrestrialize, so you can't abuse Terra Volcarona. And even then, some tiers that allow higher tier Pokemon to Terra will ban Volcarona from terraing anyway, because it's just that too doggone powerful with terrestrialization under its belt. But that aside though, Volcarona in and of itself works very, very well with this team from a round 4 perspective, because not only does it give you an option in terms of you have ways of dealing with Volcarona's checks and counters, you have a backup option for setup sweeper in terms of relying on not only Iron Valiant. Valiant can deal with stuff for Volcarona, and in return Volcarona can also deal with stuff Valiant's checks. It can set up on bulky poison types and threaten them out with Psychic if you want to run that route. And on top of that, Volcarona in and of itself being a formidable setup sweeper in and of itself, Quiver Dance, Fiery Dance, Morning Sun for recovery, it works really, really well for the archetype, especially considering you have your hazard center with Gliscor, you have Gholdengo to ensure that your hazards are going to be staying up unless you're dealing with like Mold Breaker Defog shenanigans. But regardless, Volcarona just felt the best to pair up with Iron Valiant from an offensive perspective, just because they form a very, very strong offensive core, and you have your balanced core in the back with Gholdengo and Gliscor to fall back on. So Volcarona just makes the most sense here, just so you have that additional backup win condition for this team, so you're not really overly reliant on Valiant to do all the heavy lifting. Then next up for round number 5, I opted to go with Lycanroc Dusk here for the round 5 selection, and the main thing with Lycanroc Dusk in this sense is getting some strong form of priority. Granted, there is priority already on this team with Iron Valiant and Shadow Sneak, but Shadow Sneak's not really something you're going to be bringing that often on Iron Valiant anyway, since most oftenly you're going to want to bring it as a booster energy speed attacking mon, or like a mixed life orb set or something along those lines. So having some sort of strong priority already in tow is definitely beneficial for your team. Lycanroc Dust just makes the most sense here because having strong priority is always a good option to have in the bag. And on top of that, base 110 speed already, so you're really speed tying with Pokemon like the Lotties. But more importantly, having the ability to have that strong priority right off the bat is really nice to have, especially when it comes to picking off those weakened threats for your team, especially in conjunction with all the hazard setters that goes up with Gliscor, Stealth Rock, and Spikes. And Lycanroc Dust also provides you with a Focus Sash lead set if you decide to go a bit more hyper offensive with your draft. And especially helpful in building so you're not just stuck in a balanced role. Then next up, round number 6, I decided to opt for Mesprit in this slot. Basically, the reasoning for Mesprit is going back to Iron Valiant. With Iron Valiant being a formidable breaker, the one thing that does give problems to Iron Valiant is the fact that its dual stab is resisted by poison types. So figuring out that poison types will be the main issue for Iron Valiant, having a good Psychic type Pokemon to pair up with Iron Valiant makes the most sense to deal with said Psychic types, and one of the best Psychic types available to try to get on a budget would be Mesprit. So basically what Mesprit does on this particular team is it provides you with a third Stealth Rocker, so Gliscor's not stuck being the Stealth Rocker in this case. It provides you with a Psychic type, it provides you with a ground immunity to go along with Gliscor, but more importantly, it gives you the ability to actually force your opponent into situations where they don't want to be in. For example, Mesprit does get access to Future Sight, so Future Sight in conjunction with Iron Valiant is a very formidable thing to have, or Future Sight plus any fighting type Pokemon is also very beneficial because you force in those poison types, poison types that's not Overqwil, Hisuian Quillfish, or Alolan Muck, basically. Aside from that though, you force those bulky poisons in on the Iron Valiant. If your opponent blanks on Future Type being up, and they bring in their poison type on Iron Valiant, you get to chunk them for a huge amount of damage or potentially even knock them out with Future Sight, making things a whole lot easier for your Valiant in the long run. So that's the main reasoning for Mesprit specifically on this team. The other good thing about Mesprit on this build is specifically Healing Wish. So having the ability to heal back up Volcarona or Iron Valiant to full HP, have a second chance to go for a sweep, is really good value for 10 points here for all the aforementioned reasons that I mentioned, and it just fits the mold for all the reasons I said earlier. So having a strong Psychic type to pair up with Iron Valiant in the long run will go a long way. Then with our round 7 selection, I decided to go with a bit more of the utility route here and try to round out some roles here. So round 7, we picked up Cyclizar. And the reasoning for Cyclizar is a few reasons. First and foremost, we have our second Pokemon faster than 110 speed, 121. Second most, we have a normal and dragon type, so we have a ghost immunity. Most importantly, we do have a way of getting rid of hazards with Rapid Spin. So we have our removal, we have a good utility Pokemon in Cyclizar that has the ability to get rid of hazards, can U-turn for momentum, another knockoff user, so some more item disruption right then and there, and plus you do have the ability, if you really want to, go for a setup option with Cyclizar, since it does get access to Shift Gear. So for all those reasons, Cyclizar does make the most sense of this build. You have your speed, you have your utility, you have your momentum with U-turn, you have knockoff for more added utility on top of that. So yeah, having a Pokemon like Cyclizar here does make the most sense just for those reasons, and having the ability to have removal, having the ability to gain momentum with U-turn, having knockoff for item disruption for your team, and it pairs up really well just because we have the ability to get rid of items a bit more frequently, make things easier for Valiant and for Volcarona in the long run. So yeah, for all those reasons, Cyclizar just made the most sense, and for 8 points it's relatively cheap for the most part, especially considering you still get a lot of value out of this Pokemon despite the fact that you cannot spam Shed Tail on this thing, but can you imagine Shed Tail with Volcarona and Iron Valiant? Nah, I'm good with that. But yeah, so that is the Cyclizar for round number 7. Then moving on to round number 8, I opted to go with Chestnut here for the round 8 selection, and Chestnut's role specifically fills out a few things. First off, we have a ground resist. Our team did not have one outside of Levitate and a Gliscor, so something a bit more sturdier in the ground resist department is definitely helpful in that situation. Chestnut being a bulky grass type, being a ground resist, very helpful for that. Secondly, spikes. We have a second spiker to put on this draft, so Gliscor is a bit more freed up from what it wants to do. It doesn't have to be spikes all the time. It also can access to toxic spikes, so if you want to run toxic spike Gliscor, go right ahead. So we have our second spiker, we have our ground resist, and we have, while it does give us a second fighting type Pokemon, so we do have 2 fighting type Pokemon, so we're a bit weaker to fairy, we're weaker to flying. We do have Gholdengo, we have Lycanroc to pick off any flying type Pokemon, so it's not that big of a deal, and we do have some stuff in the back that can also alleviate pressure on those fairy types. But yeah, the main role of Chestnut on this team was spikes, ground resist, and being just a bulky ground resist in general. So it's definitely necessary to have that sort of ground resist, so that with stuff like Great Tusk and Excadrill doesn't become too problematic for your team. So that is the Chestnut, and it's really good value here for only 8 points. And then the last 3 picks, we only have 15 points left, so we have to make it count. So first off, we have no bulky water, so we need to address that right here and then. So round 9, we picked up one of the more underrated bulky water types that I can think of, and that Pokemon just happened to be Lantern for 6. So Lantern is fantastic here. It's a bulky water, 1. 2, electric immunity with Volt Absorb. And then for the most part, just being a bulky pivot in general is just very nice to have. You have slow momentum with Volt Switch and even slow momentum with Flip Turn. And for the most part, it gives the team another fire resist, which was just basically Cyclizar at this point. So you have that bulky water, you have your electric immunity, and it's a good bulky water type in general. It doesn't have the reliable recovery, but for the most part, Lantern still fits his role really well, because like I said, slow bulky pivots are very hard to come by and are very hard to fit onto teams, especially when you're drafting so ridiculously fast and you're not paying attention to speed tiers. If you draft, there is a thing as drafting too fast, where your slowest Pokemon is like base 80 speed, while Lantern base 67, it's still below average, but you want to speed out, you want to spread out the lower tier speed tiers a bit. Lantern just so happens to fit the role here, like I mentioned, for being a electric immunity with Volt Absorb, a bulky water, and it's a minimally good Pokemon. It may be albeit weak, but it still fits the role of being a bulky pivot in general. Can still run stuff like Assault Vest sets, even physically defensive sets, because Lantern's HP is so ridiculously high. But for the most part, Lantern fits really well with this core. It only really has 2 weaknesses to grass and ground, and luckily for us, the Pokemon we drafted before it, Chestnut, resists both grass and ground, and we have other ways to deal with grass types with Volcarona. So yeah, we are really good on the weaknesses, and I really like Lantern as a low budget pick, especially considering that you can still fill out the role of the bulky water and fits the electric immunity really nicely. So you're not really too reliant on Gliscor being the electric immunity, because there are some electric type Pokemon that can deal with Gliscor. So really nice to pick this thing up round number 9. Then round number 10, we have no dark type on this team and no grounded poison, so we addressed both of I addressed both of those roles simultaneously and snagged up Skuntank for 5. Now Skuntank does not get access to like spikes or everything, but regardless, it's still a dark type Pokemon, so you have your psychic immunity, you have your grounded poison all in one Pokemon, and overall Skuntank is still pretty nice here. It does give you more priority with Sucker Punch, not the most reliable thing since Sucker Punch can be played around, but it fits the role regardless of being that bulky grounded poison for your team. It provides team with dark type, and on top of that, even more support for Iron Valley and Volcarona, because it does get access to Memento. Memento or I don't think it has access to Explosion anymore. But regardless, Memento does provide the team with a bit more of an offensive punch to allow Iron Valiant and Volcarona to set up a whole lot easier. So, or even Lycanroc Dust if you manage to go like an SD set, or even Belly Drum Chestnut if you want to go that route. So yeah, you definitely have options to pair up with a Memento Skuntank if you want to go that route. But basically, Skuntank fits the role of being a grounded poison, being a dark type, so you have that psychic immunity, so you're not relying solely on Gholdengo to come in and take those psychic hits. So yeah, for 5 points, Skuntank makes a whole lot of sense here, especially for the reasons that I mentioned. And then lastly, round number 11, we only have 4 points left here. There wasn't really much that made a lot of sense in terms of what to pair, what to put on this team in particular. But there was one Pokemon that at the very least fit a role that I did not talk about earlier in the rules and roles thread. So lastly, for 4 points, I decided to add on Dash Bun for 4 points. And the reasoning for Dash Bun, it's a few things, a few niche things, not really niche, but it fits out specific things for the team. So first off, while it's not the highest HP, it does provide a team with Wish support. While its HP stats pretty doggone low, base 57, it still gives you Wish support for Gliscor, for your other bulky Pokemon that lacks recovery, like Lantern, so that works out. Number 2, Fire Immunity. So having a second fire resist or immunity in this case is really helpful. It eases the pressure off a Lantern to have to deal with the fire hits. And for the most part, the other reason why I have Dash Bun on this team, for the most part, just looking at it from on a grand scale thing, while this team does have access to Cyclizar and Lantern for fire resist, the team can still get overwhelmed by a well-played Chi-Yu. And as I was putting the team together, Chi-Yu did look problematic for the team. So I decided to have more of a surefire response to Chi-Yu in the back, and that's where Dash Bun fits in perfectly. So you may be thinking that I have enough fire checks in the back. You never want to be too safe, or you don't want to make assumptions when it comes to building, and for the most part you want to make the most out of every point you have, because the last thing you want to do is make a team you're not comfortable with and you're stuck with a unoptimized team and you're forced to make changes and you're forced to break up your entire team and just make things, it just spirals downhill from there. You want to try to get it right at least on the first time. Dash Bun, for the reasons I mentioned, gives the team Wish support, gives the team a fire immunity, so you have a better response to Chi-Yu in the back. You can't go wrong with that. And yeah, so with that being said, that is the team that I have here for our Iron Valiant, Gholdengo, Gliscor core. Now moving on to the alternate options for this draft. So starting off with Volcarona, alternatively it says Volcarona, another options you can go for, it's basically the role I was trying to fit here for the Volcarona slot was pretty much anything that could have the potential to deal with poison types or help out with dealing with poison type Pokemon, while also doubling as a means of being a setup option in the back. One of those Pokemon that did come to mind when I came to putting this team together, but this more so depends on whether or not your team, your draft league does allow higher tier Pokemon to terrestrialize. Otherwise, players don't really want to think about using this Pokemon unless it can Terra, and the Pokemon that came to mind right off the bat was Espathra. While Espathra is mainly Terra banned, whether it's Terra banned by itself if other higher tier Pokemon can Terra, or it's a low tier Terra rule, Espathra still fits the role of Pokemon that can deal with poison types while still being able to be a setup sweeper. While it can't Quiver Dance like Volcarona can, Espathra still comes with the same role as being a speed boost sweeper on top of that, which is one of the best offensive abilities to have in Pokemon, and then having the ability to boost its offensive potential and damage output with access to Calm Mind. So stored power sets or even Lumina Crash can definitely go a long way in the grand scheme of things. So Espathra is definitely an option. There's other things to consider. Something like Dragonite also would work here. Double flying types, yes, but Gliscor is less so a flying type. It just comes with being able to be immune to ground types. But Dragonite can also function as a way of dealing with poison types with access to Earthquake. It gives the team more priority with extreme speed. It can set up with Dragon Dance. So something along those lines would definitely work. Even lower, even for a few little, a little bit cheaper, you can go with Salamence as another means that does the exact same thing with Dragonite minus the ability to be a priority option. And another Pokemon to consider, while it doesn't really have the true aspect of speed outside of Dragon Dance, the other option to consider would be Necrozma, which is also another Psychic type Pokemon that can deal with poison types, and on top of that provides the team with another form of hazards with Stealth Rock, can SD, can Dragon Dance, can Calm Mind, and Photon Geyser is one of the best moves in the game, especially considering it can ignore unaware users. So yeah, those 4 Pokemon are definitely an option to consider over Volcarona. Next up, Lycanroc Dusk. Another alternative would be pretty much any strong priority user. So take into account something like Crawdaunt, something like a Hisuian Arcanine or Arcanine in general. While it's not really considered a strong priority option, the option is still there. Even Entei would also work as a strong priority user with extreme speed, and just having the ability to have another means of decimating those the steel types, with your Fire Stab, and of course you get options like Stomping Tantrum to deal with Heatran. So that's also the thing to consider. And if you really want to double up on Fighting type Pokemon like I have here with Chestnut, you can also go with the option of Lucario, which is a little bit less of a round 5 pick for the most part, but the ability to have both extreme speed and vacuum wave in the back is just really nice to have. So the main thing you're going for with Lycanroc over Lycanroc Dusk here is any form of strong priority that benefits, that can function basically as a way of picking off your opponent when they're weakened from the hazards. So that's basically what you're going for in that route. Then another option for Mesprit, there's Uxie, obviously for like similar role for like a bulky Psychic type Pokemon with access to Stealth Rock, and also Memento to make things easier for Volcarona and Iron Valiant. If you already have enough Stealth Rockers, you can go from like Cresselia, which also does a similar thing without the Stealth Rock, but also provides you with Thunder Wave support, and it has reliable recovery and Moonlight, and it can also be a Calm Mind Sweeper, and it gives your team another ground immunity. And even more so, there's also like Screamtail to consider if you want to double up on Fairy types, which this team already did. Screamtail does provide you a bit more utility, it gives you another form of Stealth Rockers, another Stealth Rocker, Thunder Wave support. The only downside is, while it is a lot bulkier, it's a whole lot weaker, but that's really not the point here. Screamtail, it just really functions well as a utility user, and a utility mod in general, and provides the team with even better wish support in case you do get that and you can like change Dodge Button to something else. Then next up we have Cyclizar. Another option for Cyclizar, there is Noivern, if you do want to consider going the option of keeping the fast Pokemon with access to removal. Granted, it's not really, it's a bit of a double standard to go for the hazard stack route and then defog away your own hazards, but under normal circumstances that really isn't going to come into play much, considering Heavy Duty Boots is one of the more formidable items in the game, and Noivern in and of itself still provides you with the ability of being fast and a hard-hitting Dragon type Pokemon. You do lose out on being immune to Ghost, but for the most part it gives the team another fast option. You have the defog option, you have your fast attacker, you have your momentum with U-turn. The only downside is you lose out on knockoff. Another Pokemon to consider over that would be like Talonflame, if you do not get Volcarona. Sort of fills a similar role here, especially if you don't get like the Entei or the Arcanine pick from the Lycanroc. Talonflame also fits the role of fast Pokemon with removal. That can also function as a setup sweeper with Swords Dance, can be a disruptor with Will-O-Wisp, has recovery with Roost, and can go from there. So yeah, Talonflame is also another option to consider if you do decide to go over Cyclizar. Next up, Chestnut. Another option for Chestnut. Basically, this role was just filled out by having some sort of ground resist. So if you do not get Chestnut, another option would be something like Serena. Can also function pretty well as a ground resist. It gives the team rapid spin removal, so that's the main thing to consider with that. And then for even another cheaper option you can go with, there's Appleton can also function as a ground resist if you already have enough spikes as it is. And there's also Arboliva if you really want to go even further. Granted, Arboliva's Seed Star will hinder Gliscor's damage output because Earthquake would get weakened, but at the same time, Grassy Terrain would help out the team because it would lessen the damage for Gholdengo to take from Earthquakes. It lessened the damage from Lycanroc Dust taking damage from Earthquakes. And Arboliva in and of itself is still a strong special attacker. Slow, but it's still formidable, and it gets back the normal typing that you lose if you do not get Cyclizar. So there is that to consider. Then round number 9, instead of Lantern, if you have points to spare and you want to grab a bulky water early on, there's Rotom Wash, which can function as a bulky water. It gives you a ground immunity on top of that. Granted, it does not give you an electric immunity, so you really want to shore that up if you do not get Lantern. Other bulky waters will also work in this role as well, so stuff like Milotic, Suicune. If you want to go lower than that, there's also Quillfish, which provides you with additional Spiker if you do not get Chestnut. And if you want something with a bit more wish support, there's Vaporeon as well, which is basically some sort of bulky water that can function pretty well as a Wish Passer, so you do have that extra option. And Vaporeon also does get access to stuff like Calm Mind. It can be a disruptor with Roar and all that stuff, so you have a lot of options for a bulky water. Lantern just fits the bill here, but if you do not get Lantern, you still have those other options that I mentioned. Then next up for an option over Skuntank, there's pretty much any other grounded poison type will do. There's Muck to consider if you do not get a dark type quicker, and of course, there's also Overquill and Quillfish to consider, which also is a grounded poison and a dark type, as I did not believe I mentioned any dark types for alternate options. So yeah, having sort of something like that, like a Hisuian Quillfish or an Overquill, if you have the points to get that, then over Skuntank, then you can definitely go that route. Skuntank just fits a lot better here, just for the point allocation. And then lastly, for an alternate to Dash Button, if you do want to keep the team as it is and you're still kind of feeling like Chi-Yu is a bit of a problem, then obviously if you do not get Volcarona, then another option you can get would be like a Flareon, which is also a fire immunity with Flash Fire. It gives the team wish support. Granted, it doesn't resist dark like Dash Button does, but still it has good enough HP and special defense to the point where it can still function as a Chi-Yu check, and it can still do damage with its attacks. Another thing to consider, if you are more well prepared against those Chi-Yu teams and you still want to have some sort of wish support in the back, then you can also opt for something like a Farigiraf. Farigiraf also works pretty doggone well as a wish passer with base 110 HP. If you want to go a little bit lower than that, there's also a Girafarig if you want to conserve on your points. And it also provides you with another grass immunity with Sap Sipper. So you have the ability to mix and match as you go. But yeah, so with that being said, this has been episode number 2 of How to Draft for Pokemon Scarlet and Violet with Iron Valiant, Gholdengo, and Gliscor. This was a lot of fun to put together. I went through a lot of variations of this team. I tried to make it as best I possibly could. I tried to make it as realistic as I possibly could, and overall, the team felt good. The team felt alright. It had my roles planned out. I had my everything just looked okay in my mind, and it looked like a formidable team. Everything felt bringable. Nothing felt like a waste, and by that I mean nothing felt like a Pokemon that was just there for the sake of just being there. It didn't feel like a wasted slot for the most part. So yeah, really happy with how this team came out. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like, drop a comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. This has definitely been a blast to put together. Let me know in the comments what you think, or what would you add, or what would you build, like other Pokemon you would consider to build with this draft. And I definitely had a lot of fun making this team. I'm looking forward to hearing you guys' opinions on your own spin on this draft. So with that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and until the next time, this is Tone signing out for now. Peace out.